Okay, let's get started here. This is building a next-generation web application with ASP .NET MVC 2 and jQuery. Thanks everybody for coming. Last slot at MIX. You guys enjoyed the conference? All right. Who's enjoyed the fact that the conference is in Vegas? Right? All right. Who enjoyed it maybe a little bit too much last night? Okay. So hangovers have probably subsided a little bit, and we can kind of move on. So a little bit about me real quick, just because I think context is kind of important in any kind of technical conversation. I'm Nate Kohari. I'm the co-founder of a little web startup called Inkari Limited in Northeast Ohio, and we have a product called Agile Zen, which is basically what we'll be talking about here today. And I've been doing professional software development for about 7 years now, mostly in .NET, specifically C#, mostly on the web. I actually got started C++ and PHP on the Linux stack and quickly moved over. But my other co-founder is my wife, Nicole. She's a PhD candidate in industrial organizational psychology. And so she kind of brings an interesting theoretical perspective to the product and the business, and I handle all the geeky stuff. So if you're already a .NET developer, you might be using my work already. Ninject is a dependency injection framework for .NET. It's kind of been my pet project for the past few years. So that's me. I promise no more Ninja references in this presentation. So I wanted to start a company for a long time, and sometime last year I just said, this is the idea, let's go for it. So we launched our product, Agile Zen, or just Zen for short. And it's a software as a service web application, what you might call a rich internet application. So the idea is to take that desktop rich experience and put it on the web. And we launched in July. We hit sustainability. We're still a very small company, though. You're looking at the entire development team. So yeah, this talk really isn't specifically about Zen. It's more about what we did to extend MVC and jQuery to build the product, and kind of just a whirlwind tour of some of that stuff that came out of it. So a couple of goals. So this is a little bit different than some of the other presentations. There's not going to be any demo code or anything like that. It's all I'm going to be talking about stuff that's in production right now, examples, concrete things that we've done. And I hope that you have two takeaways. So the first one being ASP.NET is a great platform for building attractive, standards-compliant, rich internet applications. Okay? There's kind of this, I think, misconception that ASP.NET is for the enterprise or it's for intranet. And in order to do a startup, hip startup, you have to use Rails or you have to use one of the more trendy frameworks. And it's not the case, particularly with MVC around now. I mean, there's really simple ways that you get started on small things, and it can support you as you grow. The other thing is you can build RIAs without going to Silverlight or Flash, and there's nothing wrong with either of those technologies. They're great. They definitely have their place, but the three core web technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, have advanced so far in the past few years that you can do some pretty amazing things with it. You don't immediately have to jump into the proprietary sort of plugins. So why did we choose ASP.NET MVC? There was a point where we had to decide whether we were going to build on the Microsoft stack or we were going to go use something like Rails. And obviously the first reason is that I was already a .NET developer, so I was able to apply all of my skills that I'd already developed to our startup. But also a couple other reasons. One, with MVC, you get the base class library from .NET, so you get all kinds of fun toys that you're used to playing with. And ASP.NET is a proven platform for scalability. So while our business model isn't exactly one that requires massive scale, although that'd be nice, I wouldn't complain. But ASP.NET drives some of the biggest websites on the internet, and so scalability was definitely not a concern. And again, MVC gives you that nice, simple starting point, and allows it to, scale. Another reason why we were able to go with Microsoft technologies is a program called BizSpark. And there's actually talk about it right now. So if you're interested in starting your own startup with Microsoft tech, I don't blame you if you run out and go to that other presentation. But basically, BizSpark lets you back up the dump truck to Microsoft Store and load it up with whatever you need to run your business. Production licenses, development licenses, and free of charge for 3 years. Then you have to pay a nominal fee. So honestly, without this, we basically, when we launched the company, we were bootstrapped, right? So we just bet our life savings on it. We didn't have any venture capital or anything like that. And so BizSpark really allowed us to use Microsoft tech to get started. So the other kind of side of Zen, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, it's about 50-50 between the server side, which is all MVC, it's C#, and then the client side, which is all JavaScript, jQuery. So why do we choose jQuery? Well, I wouldn't write a website at all nowadays without using jQuery. It's fantastic, okay? If you haven't used it yet, you have to go check it out. John Resig, the creator's here. He was in the keynote. And there's been several really good talks on it. It's the way it's meant to be, I guess, with JavaScript. It just works. So it makes everything really simple. So a little bit about us, about Zen. And again, this is not a sales pitch or anything like that. It's just for context. So and don't get too hung up on what the product actually is. It's more about what it does. So Zen is a web-based project management system, software as a service. You sign up. It's a subscription-based model, And if you're familiar with Agile project management, and now the emerging sort of lean project management that's coming from that, you might have heard of an idea called Kanban. So Zen is based on ideas that come from lean manufacturing, specifically the Toyota production system. And this idea called Kanban, it's a Japanese word that means visual card. Okay? And Toyota uses it to manage their just-in-time inventory. So some people who are smarter than me said, you could probably apply that in an effective way to project management, specifically software project management, and you come up with the concept of a Kanban board, which is a bunch of index cards on a tack board on the wall. Okay? You may have, if you do an Agile process, you may have a storyboard, things like that. Similar kind of concept. So what we did, we said, well, that's great, but it doesn't really work real well for distributed teams, and you might want to track additional metrics and things like that. And so what we did was we put the Kanban board on the web. Okay? So our goal is to just provide a simple and flexible way to manage your work. So this is kind of the main view in Zen. Okay? The board view. Oh. And you can kind of see we have a flashy sort of interface, all kinds of wonderful animations, and of course this is completely on the web, all HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all the core tech, right? So Zen, each one of these cards here that you see, the blue and the green, represents a different work item, maybe a user story, whatever your process is. And work enters at the left side of the board, and as you work on it, you move these cards from the left, moving towards the right. Okay? And when it hits the right side of the board, it's done. So basically, these columns represent the different phases that work has to move through in order to reach completion. So you can invite other people to collaborate on the project. You can do all sorts of things. It's all geared around making it easier to work together as a team, and provides a visual way to see what's going on. So I mean, you can do all kinds of cool stuff. Maybe you want to change the color of the card to indicate something different. Maybe red would be a bug, green would be a feature, that sort of thing. But so again, jQuery powers all this. Specifically jQuery UI, there's a sortable control, and that's really what drives the entire experience here on the board. A surprisingly large amount of it is just right out of the box. So basically that's Zen in a nutshell, right? Okay, so end sales pitch. That's all I got. The rest of the presentation is really going to be all about one specific action. Okay, so what happens inside Zen when a user drags a card and drops it in a different phase? So this is the kind of represents a typical Zen request, and these aren't this isn't everything that happens in a request, but these are kind of just a few things that have interesting things I wanted to talk about associated with it. So again, it's split about 50-50 between MVC and JavaScript, right? So in any application, everything starts with an event or some sort of input things like that. And typically in a web app, that is, a JavaScript event handler, right, that gets fired. So in order to talk about that, I have to talk a little bit about how our JavaScript is structured. So in addition to using jQuery, we use a really cool tool called JS class, which was made by a guy named James Coughlin. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. But basically what it gives you is Ruby style inheritance inside of JavaScript. And I love Ruby. Ruby's a great language. And this kind of lets you bring object-oriented ideas into JavaScript. Because I don't know if you've ever built larger sort of applications using a lot of JavaScript, but it tends to kind of degrade into a big ball of mud. And I think, at least for me, and I come from like a classical sort of object-oriented perspective, not a functional one, which is really what JavaScript is all about. And so JS class helps you build a little bit more structure around it. So it lets you define classes like this story card class, and put functions in it, and instantiate one, as you can see there. So what we specifically use this for, though, is an idea called behaviors. It's kind of the way that we bridge jQuery and JS class. So a behavior is really just like a collection of event handlers, more or less, and the behavior that is supposed to happen when that event handler gets triggered. So here's just a real quick snippet from the board, the JavaScript that powers it. And it says, find everything with the CSS class story card. So that'd be all those little story cards that were, that you saw. And attach this behavior to it. So what this actually does is it finds all of the HTML elements and applies the different event handlers to them. And again, this is a kind of way, you can kind of think about it as controls in a way, but it's very lightweight and it's all based on existing elements that are in the DOM. So all of our event handlers are triggered that way, and we've got different classes. Story card's one of them. The phase columns have other ones, and basically, it drives the whole system. So we catch an event, okay? We catch the, user dragged a story event, right? So then we have to say, okay, simple question. Which card did the user move? And it sounds simple, right? And it actually really is. But there's a lot of different ways that you can, go about getting that information. Because we have to reduce what the user did down to an ID, right? Story 1, 2, 3. So what we do is kind of the second step in the process is metadata lookup. So we use HTML5 data attributes, which is a new feature in the HTML5 draft spec that kind of lets you put free-form data inside of your HTML elements. And then we use the jQuery metadata plugin to extract that information. Okay, so you can see data-project ID, data-story ID. It's just a reserved prefix. And when you use the metadata plugin, you can actually yank out a JavaScript object that has those properties and values. Okay, so you can see the resulting JSON of the JavaScript object that we pull out of there. And keep that in mind because that's going to show up here again in a minute. So now we've identified the story card, right? And so now we have to figure out where are we going to send the request, right? Because you need a URL. So everything in Zen is based around routing. And routing is one of the best new features of ASP.NET, in my opinion. It came out about the same time as MVC. I'm not sure if it resulted directly from the work for MVC because you can use it anywhere. I mean, if you have raw handlers or web forms or anything like that, you can also use it, but MVC is, basically born with routing in mind. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do routing. Typically what people do is kind of a cascading route table. So it's interpreted from the top down, and whichever one hits first is, the route. And that's not bad, but it tends to get complicated and confusing in some cases. So we just said, we'll do the brute force approach, and every action in Zen has a specific route, okay, which we cleverly call route per action. Another thing that's kind of interesting that we built on top of ASP.NET routing is an XML-based routing system. Now, if you're familiar with Ninject, this is going to seem a little strange because Ninject kind of goes the opposite way. It says XML is bad, right? But the cool thing about XML is you have context and you have hierarchy. And so things like areas and controllers, you don't have to repeat them over and over again in your route definition. So if you define your routes in code, you typically have to repeat a lot of that. And there's been some work to develop better fluid interfaces and things like that. But the thing is with routes, they're really all strings anyway, which XML is great at. There's not a lot of type information or anything like that. So XML is not a bad place to put them. YAML would work equally well. So the outermost element is the area. Areas are actually a new feature in MVC2. Basically, it's just a subsection of your application. And we do some other interesting things with areas. We've been using them for a while, even before MVC2, because Spark, our view engine, has had support for areas for a while. So we also do CSS and JavaScript bundling per area. So when you hit the external side of the site, you get a certain bundle of minified CSS and JavaScript. But then when you hit the application side of it, the real site or the real app, you get a completely separate bundle. So then the next element is the controllers. That means we have a story controller in our web project. And then finally, it'd be the route for that specific action. And so in this case, this is the route for the move action on story. So that would be the action that gets called when the user drags and drops a story card between phases. So you can see the pattern that it needs to match. And project ID and story ID, if you're not familiar with routing, those are just kind of placeholders that get additional information, the data, when you want to call it. So this XML is just interpreted at app startup, and it just builds itself into the route table just like you defined it in code. So if you've done stuff with MVC, you're very familiar with this, no doubt, inside of your views. This is the URL helper, the action method that lets you build a route. And you plug in the values and you get your nice URL. The problem is, though, with a rich JavaScript-based application, we don't do a lot of postbacks or anything like that, right? So we don't often know the URL in advance. And so we need a way to access it in JavaScript. So what we did was we built this thing called URL4, right? And it's just the same sort of syntax. It's just a global, JavaScript method that's available in all of our JavaScript, files. And it just provides that same sort of syntax as you get with the URL helper. Because remember, inside of JavaScript, you don't have access to the URL helper. It's already been rendered, right? So you're on the client side now. So same thing, right? Pull out the data, plug it into the placeholders, and you've got your URL. So remember this? That was the metadata that we pulled off the card. So the information, that metadata that identifies that card uniquely, flows into the routing system. And it's all controlled by the behavior, right? So each one can be kind of self-contained, and it understands how to look up a route, and if it needs to move itself, or if it needs to change its color, from the perspective of the story card, it can use URL4 to do that, along with the metadata. So the way this works is a file cleverly named routes.js, which is just generated at app startup. So what happens is when Zen starts up, it chews through the XML route table, builds your route table, and then generates routes.js, which is just the implementation URL4, which just uses regular expressions. By the way, I'm not showing a lot of concrete code because it's production code again, and it's very difficult to kind of separate it out and create real demos. But if you want to know about any of this stuff, I'd be happy to show it to you. So, all right, we've got the URL. We know where we're sending it. We know what we want to do. We're moving story card 4, 5, 6, between phases. So now we're actually kind of crossing over into MVC land. And the first thing that you hit are filters. And filters are actually one of my favorite features of MVC because they let you do what's called aspect-oriented programming. So this is kind of the software architect in me that has his head in the clouds. But aspect-oriented programming basically lets you separate cross-cutting behaviors, that are used all over your application, and put them in a separate class, and then apply them to everywhere that needs that behavior. So the way MVC does it, of course, is filters, right? So one of the most important filters that we use is called demand, and demand drives our whole authentication system and security system. Okay, so demand is on most of the actions inside the the app side of the project, and Security in Zen requires three different things. It's granular by project. So you need a project ID, you need the user ID, and then you need to figure out what the user is trying to do in order to make the decision on whether or not they're allowed to do that. So demand takes a parameter. In this case, the permission that governs move story would be this edit story, which is just kind of a blanket permission that says you can do something right to this story, right? And then demand actually reads out, whenever you get a request in MVC, it knows which route was hit. So it actually reads the action parameters out of the route to get the project ID. And then it already knows the user ID, of course, because we use forms authentication. And so the principle of the request is, you have access to the user ID there. So those are kind of our three pieces in order to make that decision. And if, the demand fails, if the user doesn't have access, it throws a 403, forbidden. So another filter that we use is called secured. Excuse me. And that controls whether the user is accessing it on a secured connection, HTTP versus HTTPS, right? Or SSL or whatever you want to call it. So there's actually three different ways this works, governed by SSL mode. Okay? So the three options are block, force, and restrict. So sometimes you don't want a user to access something via SSL. So basically our whole marketing site, there's really no reason to access that via SSL except for the sign-up forms and things like that. So we actually set block on there. The other option would be force, which says you cannot access that on an insecure connection. So it actually pushes you to a secured one. We use that on our login form, and anytime credit card information is passed in, things like that. And then the third one is restrict, which actually looks at the account that the user has and sees if they have a high enough plan that they've bought SSL protection, right? So if you pay enough, we sell different plans. If you pay enough, you can get SSL as one of the features. So all that does is just a 302 redirect, to push you onto the other side of the site if necessary. Transactional is pretty self-explanatory. I think there's about 1 million different examples of this one. But basically, database transaction, in our case, an Hibernate transaction. And what's nice about this is you actually get, so in MVC, a lot of times there's a read action and a write action, or at least you typically will know what the action is supposed to be doing, whether it's supposed to be reading from the database and writing out view data, and rendering a view, or it's writing to the data, it's updating, right? And so the nice thing about transactional, we started out with just transaction per request and did it for every action, unlike, when the request started and when the request was, ended. This is great for scalability, though, in a way, because you can separate out what needs transactions and what doesn't. Because typically, you don't want your selects inside of transactions because they tend to compete then with your update statements. So in very large scale situations, you could get, deadlocks on your database and things like that, at least in my limited understanding of that. So then we also have some output filters. Those are kind of input ones, but I'll just talk about a few of the output ones also. One of them is do not cache. And setting HTTP headers inside of ASP.NET is kind of a pain, and particularly caching ones, because there's several different ways to do it. And so anyways, do not cache kind of encapsulates all that stuff. And this filter is actually on the board itself, because you wouldn't want to, so you render the board, right, and you move some cards around, things like that, and then you navigate off the board. Well, if you hit your back button, you don't want to get the cached version of the board when it was originally loaded, right? Because you've actually made changes to it, or potentially someone else working on your project may have made changes to it also. And so do not cache just says, force the browser to, reload this every time from the server. Strip white space is another one. I think this is used on most actions that render view data. And what that does is actually removes all literal white space from HTML or anything that would potentially modify the way things were rendered. So one of the more annoying things is that sometimes white space is significant in HTML, and that can really kind of play havoc with your padding and margins and things like that. So not only does this help with optimization, it also helps with our CSS. It simplifies the CSS because certain browsers will interpret that in certain ways, and it's just much better to pull that white space out completely and not have to worry about it. And then, of course, the ubiquitous handle exceptions. Everybody has an exception filter in MVC, and if an exception gets thrown inside the app, it catches it and says, okay, no yellow screen of death. We're going to send you to something that's shiny and friendly. And actually, exceptions are how Zen handles all non-200 responses. So 200 being success and the standard web response. Anything that's not a 200 ends up as an exception, and that may be people might not like that, but because technically it's sort of using exceptions as logic in a way, but it kind of gives a nice way to terminate the request. So inside an action, if you try to perform an action on something that doesn't exist, a non-existing resource, it's going to just throw a 404 exception, right? And likewise, the demand filter we just talked about, when something fails, it throws a 403. So, boy, I'm burning through this. Good. You guys are going to have some good questions, right? All right. Anyways, we're getting close to the end. So the next step would be kind of so now we're in the action, right? We've passed all the filters. We're allowed to access it. We're on the right secure connection or not, depending on what we're trying to do. I guess in this case, we're moving a story, so you need to potentially be on a secure connection. And so then now we're actually into the heart of Zen. And so a little bit about what that looks like. There's several different layers in Zen, as you would probably expect with any kind of typical application. We just talked about filters, right? Security, cross-cutting concerns. Everybody has to pass through the filters first. And the next step would be the controller. And in Zen, the only thing the controller is allowed to do is interpret the request. Okay? So it tries to figure out what the user wants to do and whether or not that makes sense. So if you try to move a story that doesn't exist, that doesn't make any sense. So that's handled by the controller, right? It communicates with the browser and it sets up any view data if there is going to be a result sent back, right? And but that's all the controller is allowed to do. It doesn't actually make any changes to stories or anything like that. So everything else is kind of delegated to the domain service layer, or whatever you want to call it. That's the layer that's allowed to modify the data model. It also broadcasts events, which is what we're going to talk about here in a minute. And so this is really the heart of all the business logic in Zen, is the domain service layer. That's really where everything is modified. But the domain service isn't actually allowed to, it doesn't know anything about persistence, right? So that's delegated instead to a repository layer. In our case, we use Hibernate for the repository. And what's kind of interesting about this is that the data language that Zen speaks is LINQ on the top three layers, and Hibernate, inside the repository. So, throughout the majority of the application, it doesn't know anything about Hibernate, right? We just use LINQ. And inside of the repository, we use Hibernate.LINQ, previously called LINQ for Hibernate, I think. To try to, it translates between LINQ and the Hibernate criteria API. So what's kind of cool about these different layers too, and again, this is definitely a testament to MVC, because it lets you separate things like this very easily. In web forms, it was a lot more difficult, right? If you had experience with that, because everything always tended to become this big monolithic sort of thing. And of course, from my perspective, there was it's very difficult to do dependency injection in web forms, and MVC really makes it dead simple. All we do is override the controller factory to activate all of the controllers through Ninject, which there's a ninject.web.mvc framework that you can use to do the same thing. And basically you get all your controllers can have any services you want. So that's how everything is wired up, right? But again, the cool thing about it is since all the layers are separate, if you're into unit testing, you can unit test each layer independently, right? Because all you have to do is mock out the other layers, in order to isolate it. So definitely, again, a testament to MVC being, very testable. So kind of the last thing would be the event broadcast system. And from inside the domain service, so stepping back a little bit, one of the ideas of Zen, again, is to try to improve communication between people on your team. And so one of the ways we do that is when things happen, a car is moved or edited or whatever, we send out notifications to everybody that's involved, right? So you can subscribe to these notifications in different ways. And the two ways we do that are email and instant message, okay? So you can see we've got an SMTP service, just a mail service, sends out email, and XMPP, which is what we use for instant messaging. So inside the domain service, things happen. I move a card. It queues an event inside the messenger, right? The idea of that being that it's asynchronous. So it just stuffs it in a queue and says, okay, I'm done. Returns, whatever it needs to return back to the user. And so the messenger then passes things off. It looks at what happened, and it tries to figure out, okay, well, what notifications do I need to send, right? And then it delegates out to SMTP and XMPP, which send out the real notifications. So the SMTP service really just sends to a, just a regular mail server, right? SMTP server. And the XMPP service delegates out to an XMPP server called eJabber-D, which is actually written in Erlang, which is a very, very cool piece of software. But not only then can we send to XMPP networks like Google Talk, but then also on eJabber-D we have gateways to the different proprietary networks too, other proprietary networks like Windows Live and AIM and ICQ and those. So I am way ahead of time. That's awesome. So I apologize for that. So again, you guys are going to have great questions, right? So again, this was just, like I said, a whirlwind tour, a very fast whirlwind tour through some things in Zen. And again, we just wanted to give you a concrete idea of what you can build with it. And yeah, if you are looking to start your own company, or you just want a simple framework that can kind of grow along with your product, it's MVC and jQuery is definitely the way to go. So, who's got excellent questions? The microphones are right there. Somebody spare me. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, actually I had two questions.
Sure.
First was on the way you're storing the data for the client-side stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't know if you had looked into the data stuff that's built into jQuery, or there was a reason why you went the way versus the stuff that's built into jQuery.
Mm-hmm. So the jQuery data method is actually really cool, and that's what drives all of the behavior stuff. That's where that class gets stuffed into the the data system in jQuery. But really, it's really kind of different, right? Because the metadata gets drawn into the HTML itself. It becomes part of the element, and then we actually use a plugin to pull it back out, right? So internally, there's a lot of stuff that uses the the data system in jQuery, but that wouldn't be one of them. Does that make sense? Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. The next question I had was on the filters when it came to the exception handler.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that anything that wasn't 200 was essentially considered an exception handler.
Mm-hmm.
And I know with the routing that kind of can do stuff for like the 300 to 301 type redirects. If you do have a valid 301 type of action from your controller, how does it deal with that as far as an exception goes?
I may have misspoke on that. It may not be only it may not be anything that's not 200. It may just be 400 and above, now that I think about it. Because 302 is still technically a successful request, you know? Yeah, and you have to get to the 400 level in order for it to be, you know, a real error. So I think in that case you're right.
Okay, I was a little worried about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask, if you were to build another product today, would you ever consider building it in Iron, Ruby on Rails, you know, Ruby on Rails and .NET?
Yeah.
Instead of MVC, you know, you said you love Ruby, so.
I think so. I definitely think there's a place for it. And Iron Ruby, I haven't filed it for a little while too, honestly. So I don't know what state it is in, you know, whether it can run Rails and that sort of thing. I know Jimmy Schmetti is here, but I haven't talked to him about it. And I missed his talk. So maybe I'm not the authority on Iron Ruby. But, you know, from my perspective, absolutely. I think it's definitely something, you know, that would be interesting. Because again, you get the whole power of, you know, the infrastructure, you know, of the .NET stack, the Microsoft stack, you know, but, you know, you get to write it in a fun language like that. One thing I have been tinkering with is, again, our view engine is Spark, which is fantastic, by the way. I didn't have anything in here with Spark, and mainly that's because we didn't build anything on top of Spark because we didn't need anything. It just had all the support that, you know, was necessary. So anyhow, one thing I've been tinkering with is Spark lets you define some of your views in Ruby. So it's kind of more similar to ERB rather than just having things in, you know, C#. And so I didn't start out doing that way, but I've been tinkering with it. So there's all kinds of, you know, solutions for different things. And I'm not a purist in the least. It's always best to breed for me. You know, so if something makes sense, then absolutely, you know, I would do it. Yeah. Sure.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
2 questions. Number 1, I missed the talk on the MVVM framework.
Hmm?
Can you describe the difference between MVVM and MVC?
I can't, because MVVM is something that is used, in my understanding, commonly in WPF and Silverlight, 2 technologies that I don't have a lot of experience with. So I would not be the one to ask about that. But MVC, you know, model view controller, and so it'd be model view view model, right, is the other one. So yeah, I don't think I can answer that question really effectively. MVC is like it's a great model for the web because it just gives you, you know, free form. It maps basically URLs directly to method calls, more or less, right? There's a little bit more to it, obviously, but. And then MVVM is a lot more stateful, you know, which of course you don't have on the web. So that would be one of the prime differences. But you'd have to ask someone that's much more familiar with MVVM to really get a good answer on that.
No problem.
Okay.
Number 2.
Sure.
Visual Studio 2010 has jQuery support, correct?
Mm-hmm. It does.
What would you recommend to a newbie like me in getting started with jQuery in Visual Studio 2010?
They have an absolutely great website. The API documentation, actually they just improved it for the new release too, and one of the best open source websites by far, you know. So I would say definitely start there. There's some great books. Which one? I think it was jQuery in Action is one that I got. So that would be, I can't remember who. Hey, I got Amazon though, right? Well, I'll look it up for you. But anyhow, I'm pretty sure that would be that's the book that I learned from. So that'd be an excellent one. And I know John Ressig he's got a book coming out. Although I don't know how jQuery specific it is. It's Secrets of the JavaScript Ninja. So I'm sure that will be a good one too. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think it looks really awesome that there's jQuery IntelliSense and VS 210,
Mm-hmm.
but I've been using jQuery for a couple of years, if that's possible. And really, the way to go is trying it with the Firebug
Mm-hmm.
in
Yes.
products, so you actually work against the DOM and get the response right away. You can probably do the same thing in IE9, I'd guess, but I mean just really to work with it in the browser, and not just in Visual Studio.
Absolutely.
Right?
And
I guess you've probably done the same thing, right?
Firebug, yes. Firebug, if you develop for the web, and yes, I'm advocating Firefox. I love the browser. And the only thing that keeps me, honestly, though, using Firefox is Firebug. I'm all on Chrome now. And if you develop for the web, get Firebug, because it will save you countless hours of work. So, yeah, absolutely.
Kind of a newbie question.
Sure.
So, is there a book or a framework or a pattern, a little bit like the Rails, that you could start off with? In other words, you explained that you're kind of using the minimal set of technologies. You've got WCF or WPF, and I'm just wondering if there's anything which is like a starter kit for MVC2.
I know there's a lot of good examples out there, Nerd Dinner being one of them, right? And in terms of frameworks, though, there is one. What is it called? Sharp Architecture. Thank you. I can't remember the guy's name, but if you look for Sharp Architecture, that actually kind of, the idea is to build sort of an opinionated framework similar to how Rails was, for MVC, right? And is it MVC specific, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yes, that would be a definitely one to check out. Sure. Good.
Hi. This is not so much a question as a tip. I think you should actually look into MVVM, because we're at the moment developing quite a complex application in JavaScript with jQuery, and we were looking at a way to sort of structure the whole these different flows of data and stuff like that, and looked into the MVVM and built like a binding engine so that you could use it in JavaScript, and it actually works really, really well. So that could be an idea.
Yeah, that's not actually a bad idea at all. So one thing that we're trying to do is we have kind of a very RPC designed API, more or less. So you saw like the move thing, and what we really want to do is get more towards a purely RESTful API. And so in that case, we would be passing a lot more like raw data, back across the wire, which is something that we started out doing partials instead. That's kind of what happens. So when the final result of this whole circle is to return a partial view of the story card. And so one thing we're trying to do is move back towards just sending JSON back across the wire and do client-side templating. So in that case, yes, I think MVVM may be a really good way to go. So I'll have to look into it more. So, I forgot to mention too, I got to give a plug to TechPub, and not for any reason other than it's a really great site. So if you want to learn more about jQuery and MVC, go to techpub.com, and I actually have quite a few 30-day trials of it that I'll give out too. So I think I was originally going to do that for everybody that asked a question, but I'll just give them out randomly. If you want one, come on up and get it. But it's basically a screencast site. So there's a lot of really high quality screencasts on there. There's things on Git and Mercurial, if I can talk. It's better than PubSub Hubbub, right? I can never say that correctly. But anyhow, there's a lot of great screencasts on there. So if you're looking to learn, and I know there's an Inject series coming up too. So if you're interested more there too, then it really gets a great site. Sure.
Can you mention the specific business cases that kept you from considering Silverlight Flash as a media for this?
Sure. So besides my own bias against, again, now wait a minute, I caught myself because I said I wasn't a purist. But I'm a really big fan of the three core web technologies. So for me, it would have to not work in that sphere. If I couldn't do it with HTML and JavaScript, I would consider something like Silverlight. And again, I'm not bashing either of those things. The real problem is, though, too, you get some difficulties with adoption. So HTML is universal, whereas, no matter what the penetration is of Flash or Silverlight, you're always going to have people that, don't want to install it, can't install it for whatever reason, right? And we actively limit our customer base. One thing we do is we don't support IE6. And yeah, bring down IE6, please. So I had a picture of Douglas Crockford's talk. He had a big IE6 must die. So anyhow, but point being, we do actively limit our customer base if necessary, if it makes sense for us, because IE6 support would be very difficult for us to build. But I think, honestly, Silverlight and Flash would, if we built the whole website in that, would limit us so much that we would have had a difficult time succeeding to the point where we have. And that's just kind of a gut feeling, more than anything else. But, yeah. Any other questions? I'll take the inject questions, too, if you have any. But.
Can you speak to how you handle accessibility concerns and graceful degradation in your system?
Not very well is how we handle it. So degradation is difficult when you have, kind of the drag and drop sort of experience, that we have, and it's hard to, so I guess it depends on what level you have to degrade. So also we have, you can attach files to cards. So that's one place where we do use Flash, for multiple file uploads. So in terms of graceful degradation there, you fall back on just, the standard browser support. But, from a more accessibility standpoint, we don't do that very well yet. And again, the reason for that is, the product's only been around, what, 9 months now? Wow, that's a fast 9 months. And again, you're looking at the sole developer. So that's something we need to get better on, for sure. And I would imagine the way, we would just lean heavily on CSS to do a lot of that stuff.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. We have a website very, very similar like the one that you show us. We are also using MVC and jQuery. And for all the data access, we were considering using Hibernate, just like you did, or some other ORM tool like Subsonic. But we were very worried about the performance impact. So we finally decided to implement everything using data readers, okay, for performance.
Sure.
How do you handle those worries?
I think most of the time those worries, honestly, are unfounded. And Hibernate it's a beast of a product. It's very complicated and in some cases convoluted in how it does its work. But it's very good at what it does overall. And oftentimes the queries that it generates are better than I would write myself. And so really it comes more down to once you've got the specific queries, you have to match up your indexes and things like that, from a database perspective. But I don't believe that you ever have to go all the way down. And again, it depends on the kind of application. And I don't mean to make blanket statements. For us, I mean, we are not high scalability. Again, that's not our business model. There was a talk from the MySpace guys, and they're doing just some amazing things with the robotics, toolkit that powers their high scalability. And it's just because they're at such a high level, so far beyond it, and that stuff is just completely beyond me. I don't understand how any of it works. I think that the right way to go about it is to solve the problem if you have the problem. So you can always drop back from in Hibernate and go to raw data access in cases where you need to do that. But I would try not to prematurely optimize. That tends to be the case. And I'm not, again, I don't know what your situation is or anything like what the product does and that sort of thing, what scale is. But yeah, I mean, I would just, again, it's particularly when you have a startup, you have to solve the problems only when you have the problems, because if you start solving problems you don't have yet, you don't get the stuff done that you need to get done. And so for me, I just kind of put a blinder on unless I can see, concrete evidence that says this is a problem. Like the site is running slow. I need to fix this. You know what I mean?
You seem to have been an early adopter of MVC, and I'm wondering if you've tried to move to MVC 2 yet, because I'm assuming you're on 1.
No, actually, we're on 2.
You are on 2. Did you find any issues upgrading or changing?
No, which is awesome. Nice work to Phil here, and team. It was literally almost a drop-in replacement. There was a couple things that I had to change, and it was weird things I was doing internally. Because the way we render email messages, we send HTML emails. We pipe that through Spark, our view engine. And so there was a couple things that I was doing, using more of the low-level stuff that's in MVC. So some of that changed a little bit. And then, of course, Ninject, the MVC integration had to be updated because the syntax of the controller factory changed. But those were, I think, the only 2 things, literally, and it was maybe 2 lines of code that had to be changed, and it was, again, drop-in and replacement. The cool thing, too, was Lou Dehardin, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, too, made some really cool updates to Spark to match up Spark's views, or I'm sorry, Spark's areas with MVC2 areas. So immediately our areas that we already had from Spark became MVC2 areas. Not necessarily from like a project in Visual Studio perspective, but from the perspective of the app. MVC2 is mostly an additive thing. So it's, you don't really, not a lot was really changed. A lot of stuff, cool stuff was added. But yeah, it was very easy. Any other questions?
This is kind of an overly specific question, but I was just wondering, the client-side event stuff that you showed early on, is there a specific reason that you didn't use jQuery's built-in custom events?
Yes. Well, okay, so when the first cut at that, and I meant to mention this, I glossed over this a little bit. The first cut at behaviors was using the jQuery plugin syntax, right? And it worked pretty well, but it still kind of turned into a blob because you have to continually extend the jQuery function, more or less. So if you looked at any of the plugin code, that we basically wrote a plugin for each class, so to speak. So a story card, plugin, and that was kind of the collection of behaviors. So, wait a minute, what was the question? Now I started rambling.
What I was thinking is specifically how you can, say, bind card move, use a made-up event, and then later have that trigger to
sure.
do sort of what you were showing. I was wondering if there was some good stuff there I didn't know about that was better than that.
We actually, so a couple of things. One, when I first started writing Zen, there was limited support for live, and I don't think there was delegate, which is cool new features now in jQuery that are available. And so a lot of the behavior stuff may actually kind of evolve, and some of those events, might move towards the more bubbling approach that those use, right? So that's one of the reasons. It's a little bit of legacy stuff going on. But the other reason is we actually do use like event delegation in certain cases. So there's actually a pub sub model inside of every page. So there's also a class for the screen, the page itself that's drawn, in addition to all the little behavior controls that are on the page, right? And the way they communicate is they actually send an event off of the window itself. So there is some more interesting stuff that goes on with the eventing model. using custom events. But yeah, I guess I glossed over that. I should have added that. Then I wouldn't have finished my presentation in 40 minutes. But details. Good question, though. All good questions. Anybody else? Okay. This will probably be the last one, although this is the last talk, so we can stay here all night.
We'll do that to you. So, just wondering about, the user interface you started off with. If you can, consider building the user interface out of widgets, so you can, compose your Zen Agile into other solutions.
Sure. That is actually something that we've looked at, and we haven't quite gotten there yet, because again, it's still all very it's modular, but there's still that whole controlling screen class, that kind of orchestrates the whole thing. And so, in order to embed, I think there's definitely a lot of potential to embed. Is that what you're talking about? Taking the like this, the board view and kind of putting it into something else?
Yeah, I'm thinking about putting those design objects or those composable pieces into widgets. And then I was thinking about, what are some of the difficulties? For example, if you were to do that, how would you message between the widgets and where would you dock them?
I guess it would depend on what the embedding kind of application would be, right? And that's an excellent question. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it that much. I mean, we thought about embedding the board in certain situations. So you had maybe an intranet site, right, that you use already to share with your team, maybe a wiki or that sort of thing. And it might be kind of cool to embed your Zen board in there so you can manage your your stories from within that. But in terms of the difficulty, number one we would have to go towards a more RESTful API, for sure. It would really come down to a more RESTful API and better control over the event handlers, because they weren't really designed with that in mind, and so I'm sure there'd have to be a little bit of work done to support it.
Thank you.
Sure. I think I'm actually over on time, so I appreciate all the questions too. You guys bailed me out there. Awesome. So.